Now, here's a Chinese puzzle. When is a belt not a belt, and when is a road not a road? It isn't a $64,000 question. It runs to hundreds of billions, and the answers are coming up as you watch Roundtable with me, David Foster. Strangely, the road is a sea route from China to Africa and the Mediterranean. The belt is a series of overland corridors connecting China with Europe via Central Asia and the Middle East. And it could link almost 70 countries, which is 2/3 of the world's population.
Repaving a historical pathway from the east through to Europe. Referred to as China's Belt and Road Initiative, it aspires to revive the old Silk Road, opening up trade routes for prosperity. Can this new economic corridor deliver fortune to the more than 60 countries it will traverse? Or is China merely showcasing its economic might in order to fulfill its geopolitical aspirations? The Belt and Road Initiative will follow two routes: a land road stretching past Eastern Asia and into Western Europe, and a maritime route passing South Asia and Africa. The new Silk Road will cover 65% of the world's population and more than 40% of the world's GDP. Over $300 billion have been spent on it already, and China plans to spend another $1 trillion over the next decade. It's set to rival the proposed transatlantic trade and investment partnership, of which China and Russia are not a part. And it could eclipse the G7 or the G20 in infrastructure development for low-income countries. And if the US adopts a more protectionist agenda, China could step in and fulfill its economic vision of a more open world. But is China's vision less benign? The initiative has been criticized as a smokescreen and an attempt to exert control over the Indian Ocean. Economists speculated that some countries could become debt-trapped, paying money back to China to build roads to nowhere. And research has cast doubt over the positive economic impact of Chinese investment in Africa, as inexpensive Chinese imports can displace local African firms and hurt employment in small businesses. Will this new Silk Road be any different than China's endeavors in the past? Can the new Silk Road bring prosperity to the nations involved? Or is China just flexing its muscles, aspiring toward geopolitical and economic domination?
With me at the round table today, we have Dr. Yu Ji, head of China Foresight at LSE Ideas, which is a foreign policy think tank at the London School of Economics. We have Jinny, chief China economist at the ICBC Standard Bank, helps companies who perhaps want to invest in One Belt, One Road. We have Dibyesh, Anand, head of politics and international relations at the University of Westminster, and political commentator Charlie Wolfe. Thank you all very much indeed for coming in. Dibyesh, let me ask you this one first of all. We've had a statement from the National People's Congress today, effectively China's parliament, saying, listen, don't misunderstand, this is not geopolitical, not geostrategic. We're not trying to take over the world with this. Perhaps not, but they're getting very sensitive about it.
They are. I mean, China is a very interesting country, which is an emerging power and a very powerful country, and yet they always talk about being very sensitive about everything. Now, let's remember, in 19th century, we have been through this, which is empires who refuse to call themselves imperial. So they always use the terms such as free trade and progress and market in order to control other parts of the world. We have seen that with British and the French in 19th century, and possibly we might see that kind of thing also with China in the coming future.
So they hold their hands up and say, no, 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 not us, we're not to blame for this. Is it, in fact, a form of empire building? What do you think?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily consider it a form of empire building. I would rather consider it's a combination of a foreign policy initiative together with a domestic affairs initiative. By looking at the Belt and Road, I mean, by building infrastructure, building telecoms, these are what China are very good at, by having those expertise. And now, given the domestic market are almost like saturated, and therefore perhaps we would need somehow to export that China's expertise to somewhere else.
Well,
so I wouldn't really
that's
consider.
Sort of a nice way of looking at it, I suppose. But going back to your suggestion that this was a form of colonialism that was dressed up as other things in the 19th century. If you go to another country and you give them ports, if you go to another country and give them roads, if you give them railways, if you give them legal systems, if you give them money, that's a form of empire building, is it not?
I wouldn't necessarily. I mean, it depends on who participate. No, because
we're talking about 60 different countries that have all got a stake in this.
the question is, we are still unknown because you have 60 different countries participating, and how the fund would be distributed. I think Jenny would know better than I do. But what we should really look into is who is in charge and who has the upper hand to dictate what kind of projects where we are. So in order to, before we have draw a conclusion, we need to have answer those questions first, and then draw the conclusion what is a form of new imperialism or not.
Okay, so China's investing perhaps $1 trillion, give
well,
or
not
take.
just China.
Okay, but other countries as well. But China's putting a lot of money into this.
Right.
By giving countries money to help with some of these projects, what is China buying?
Well, this is exactly the point. It's not actually China trying to buy. This is the old phase of China going out policy, which is effectively to give loans in return for either resources or other things. But this, in effect, I mean, to the naked eye, it may seem like a similar strategy, but really, if you understand it better, first of all, it's not just 60 plus countries, it's anyone who is interested. And that has been a point made very well, because what it is some official financing for the first part of it, which is really to attract attention of a lot of countries. The second phase is about the attraction of private investment.
But Jinny, let me we'll get to private investment in just a moment. But if you go to one of the poorer countries, let's say one of the East African countries, and China's been investing an awful lot of money in Africa over the last 10 to 15 years. If you go there and you ostensibly loan them money which they can't pay back, that's not a loan, is it? That's buying your position there. You answer that one first, and we'll go to Charlie.
Right, so the answer to that is the One Belt, One Road is not about providing the loan. What it is
You
that...
did just mention loans, though.
I mentioned loan, which is the old type of Chinese financing abroad. Belt and Road initiative is about a Chinese angle within the project, not necessarily Chinese financing. It could be a Chinese insurance company getting involved. It could also be a type of Chinese contractor getting involved in the project, not necessarily Chinese money. That's the most important thing.
All right, we'll come back to that in just a moment, but I know Charlie wants to jump in.
I was harkening back to what you said at the beginning about empire building under a different name, and someone in the production office here earlier quoted von Clausewitz to me earlier, and I said, well, you know, people that quote Clausewitz don't really know much about Clausewitz, and I know that because I do it myself, but...
Well, help me, Charlie, because if you're quoting Clausewitz and I don't know much about Clausewitz, then I don't know who will. So
the Austrian military expert von Clausewitz said that politics was war by other means, and essentially policy is politics, which is war by other means. And I think that's what's going on here. I mean, yeah, there's no bullets involved and war, but it is a policy initiative that is trying to take in large masses of land and put it under a hegemony. When I read about OBOR for the first time...
OBOR being One Belt, One Road.
One Belt, One Road.
Yeah.
The first thing that came to mind was the European Union. You know, in striking ways. Again, you know, the European Union will say it's democratic, and I'm not going to comment one way or the other about whether OBOR is democratic or not. I couldn't claim to be an expert on it. But when you look at the European Union claiming to be democratic and the things they're doing, and it's like, no, it's Brussels, it's bureaucrats trying to control and trying to, you know, bring all things into the center. Well, this is, in a sense, what's going on here.
I see you itching to get
No, in fact, I think I won't say that, let's say, OBR is inevitably empire building, but it's possibly empire building, let me put it that way. Because, of course, China does face a lot of competition, not only from US, but more crucially from the two second and third largest economies in the region that include that include Japan and India. So there's competition. But going back to empire building, again, if you see, let's say, history of empires built by Britain and France in 18th, 19th, and early 20th century, we do find that a lot of time, even the British did not see themselves as building an empire till it was built. It did involve exporting the surplus capital. It did involve infrastructure. Now, going back to China, again, a lot will depend upon what the partner countries will do vis-a-vis China. This is where the asymmetry of power comes in. You alluded to that. So when you have a very poor country and they take loan, how would they interact? How would they respond? Or they take money for infrastructure, which is good, but what kind of infrastructure? Who gets the jobs? Because when you take example of how China invests in various countries, in most countries, the jobs go back to the Chinese workers and Chinese.
They're building a big port called Gwadar
in Pakistan.
In Pakistan. Shifting from Karachi to Gwadar. And the people in that area are saying, hang on, we have got very little work out of this, apart from a shoe company which says it sold 10 times as many shoes to Chinese workers. So let's talk about the India-Pakistan side of things here.
Yeah, I was saying before, I don't want you to think that what I'm suggesting is something nefarious or bad. It may actually be very good, but I saw the similarities to the things like steel production. The Chinese, I think was the figure I read, were producing over 100 million tons more than they need. And this is getting.
They might want to dump it,
which
is something that President Trump's a bit worried about.
They're currently dumping it now as a way of building infrastructure and using it to these different countries.
Let's talk about the practical side of things. And we mentioned Pakistan there. Yeah, the port of Gwadar, as opposed to the port of Karachi, Chinese workers coming in to do this. There is an element of a problem here between India, Pakistan, and China, because if China's in bed further and further with Pakistan, and India feels like it's getting sort of closed in, then that creates its own tensions, doesn't it, in a region where India is a massive country, massive economic power. Do you want to?
Well, I mean, that's right. I mean, that's a part of. I mean, there's several different voices inside China regarding to Belt and Road Initiative as well. I mean, people really don't know how are we going to handle the geopolitical complexity, not just existing between India and Pakistan, but also China-Russia relations as well, because China directly marching towards the backyard of the Russian Republic. So
and what's been the reaction so far? Because it's partly involved, isn't it?
It's a partly involved, but Russia's response has been rather timid and very cautious, because what China's marching towards the West is directly almost opposing to what Russia's march towards the East. So this is a very kind of like a geopolitical games in here. And then the answer is China hasn't really fully aware what kind of political risks it's going to facing in the next 10 or 20 years in order to facilitate the eventual success of the Belt and Road Initiative.
Jinny, do you want to jump in, and then I've got a question for you?
Yeah, my key point, and I think I absolutely agree. I mean, I think you can only look at it from a perspective where, are you talking on behalf of government or are you talking on behalf of the people? Because from a government perspective, yes, they've got to be very sensitive about how they get involved. And this is exactly why, for example, our Prime Minister, when she visited China, was also very careful about how she handles this issue. I mean, this is echoed around the world. It's very careful from a government perspective. Now, if you're just a person, you're a businessman or you're a person looking at this from a student perspective, it's very different because you're more interested in what's happening at the grassroots. So in terms of trade links, in terms of capital flows, and also in terms of people flows, because, for example, tourism is a huge part of this, and this is where some of the tourist agencies can really benefit. So you have to look at it from two very different ends of the perspective.
I'll come to you in just a second, but you may want to answer this one. $1 trillion, $900 billion. It depends who you read, but it may even be more than $1 trillion going into this, no matter where it's from, China or from other countries that are getting involved. And yet we mentioned Africa earlier with China's involvement in Africa. Studies have shown that very little of the money that China poured into Africa has been of benefit to the people in those particular countries. And a lot of that is because the money's going into people's trousers, into their pockets, into their bank accounts, wherever. How do you make sure that this is not a means to enrich a lot of people who will be awarding contracts and delivering that sort of service?
Number one, as I already talked about, is the change in terms of the form of financing. So traditionally, when China invests outwards, particularly in Africa and even in Latin America, it has been official financing through Chinese banks, policy banks like China Development Bank, other state banks. Now, this is done very much on the bank's balance sheet, so that's effectively banks lending money to projects, to countries.
How do you make sure it's doesn't go to the
Exactly,
wrong
that's
people?
the challenge. And that has been the case where, first of all, it may end up in the wrong pockets. Secondly, it's not properly monitored. And also what happens is that a lot of people and companies can't repay the loan. So this is why China has a huge debt issue, not just...
Well, I don't know whether it's an
these
issue, Jinny. You
issues.
see, the thing is, if, as we said, if you lend somebody some money, you have a hold over them if they can't pay it back. But you also end up in this position of saying, okay, if we're going to get into giving money away, yeah, it's okay if it goes to some of the wrong people because we don't have bribery laws that cover that sort of thing, and we're buying influence in those countries.
Can I? Okay.
Sure. I mean, and just to end up my point there, my point is that that's why China's shift needs to be away from official financing towards private
And has that happened?
equity. Yes, and not in all cases, I have to say, and that is the key challenge going forward to assess the success of this project.
Yeah, there are two issues. One is going back to Gawad. I'll just say something about that and go back to this whole idea of private and public in case of China. Now, Gawad, of course, it poses a challenge to both India, Pakistan and China relation, that's for sure, right? So India sees investment by China in Gwadar as not economic but very much geopolitical, and that's what it is, right? Because of course China wants to avoid the Malacca Strait dilemma, which is reliance upon particular sea lanes of communication controlled by US and its allies. Therefore, it wants a port in Gwadar. So that's a challenge. So by building a port there, by the way, CPEC, which is China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, preceded OBOR, and building it there, India is being alienated. So that's a big challenge for China. In fact, I would say OBR poses more challenge for China than for anyone else in this case. But there's something else which we haven't mentioned is, now the people, local people in Gwadar are Baloch. Baloch are fighting for freedom or more rights within Pakistan, or either freedom from Pakistan, more rights within Pakistan. There's a recent report where Chinese government is directly negotiating with Baloch separatists to make sure that there's no kidnapping of Chinese workers.
Can you imagine the difficulty in 60 plus countries?
So now, can you also, this goes against Chinese foreign policy. Chinese foreign policy officially is about non-interference in internal affairs of other countries, which implies...
Isn't that in quotes there?
In quotes, yeah, it is. Because it does interfere in Pakistan, it interferes in Zambia, we've seen it. And this goes back to a question, point you were raising is, if China invests that heavily in any country, and if there's political instability, would China keep out as internal, not non-interference, or would it actually intervene? And my sense is it will intervene.
Okay, I want to bring Charlie in at this particular point, because one of the things we've heard in the last few days is Donald Trump talking about steel tariffs, penalizing countries, and here we have China, which is accused of dumping steel. What is it otherwise that the United States is worried about here?
Well, I mean, Donald Trump, the interesting thing is, funny enough, of the top 10 steel producers that America buys off of, China comes in, doesn't even come in at number 11, I think, and 8 of those are allies. But I think, Donald Trump is someone who's dealt with a lot of steel over his life.
So not so much steel, which we can sort of talk about, but what else is the US worried about?
He has said quite often during the campaign about currency manipulation. There was obviously in the past the taking of intellectual property, which I don't think is as bad now. I get the impression, I could be wrong.
And is this to do with OBOR?
Well, it may or may not be, but it's from America's perspective. This is the
America's perspective of China as a whole.
Yeah,
okay.
This is what worries the president, is that he's been dealing with China and dealing with, again, constantly he would talk about Chinese currency manipulation and saying we're getting ripped off, was his feeling. That we're not getting a fair deal.
So he doesn't trust what he's hearing?
No, probably not.
Okay. Let me put this one out here, because I've got a little list. I couldn't find it, if you remember, just before the programme. Dumping, that's steel. Security, real and financial. Well, we've sort of covered that. Corruption to some extent. And then the environment. If you start to build ports, if you turn Maldivian islands perhaps into your fiefdoms, we've seen what happened in the South China Sea. We're taking atolls and building airstrips and military areas out there. If you go hell for leather through different parts of your country, building railroads, etc., 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 you have either no responsibility or an awful lot of responsibility. What does China have here?
Well, I wouldn't say, this should be 100% China's responsibility. I think, again, back to the issue where Jenny was mentioning regarding financing and as well as environment, we should somehow have a third party to judge each participant's behavior independently. So we do need that sense of international arbitrary somehow to make the right or wrong judgment in here. So that obviously back to related to the environmental issues, but also related to how the financing issues as well in here.
But you're almost talking about divine intervention here, aren't you? You're talking about something that is never going to happen, but would be a wonderful ideal.
In the ideal scenario, that should happen, and as soon as you can
Court
see
of the
this,
supreme being who says you're doing this wrong or doing this right.
Or
Almost like
even worse would be John Kerry's international test.
or International Court of the
Yeah.
Belt and Road Initiative. I mean, as you can see already, there are plenty of the British law firms and the British legal system are getting extremely interested
one
in.
group that would actually benefit.
Yeah, they have been
Lawyers.
extremely interested in that kind of scenario. And also, I would say this is also a general a learning curve for China. You have that sense of expectation and the capability cap. So on the one hand, the rest of the world expect China to do much more, whereas we're only the country which emerged from the center of international stage back to 1979 until now. There's so many new scenarios and new things we haven't really learned how to handle yet as such. So for me, I would consider it's really a steep learning curve for the Chinese government how to deal with a proper global foreign policy.
Two questions for you. One of your jobs is to advise companies that want to get involved with this.
That's right.
So how do you do that? And secondly, what do you think the eventual benefits will be? Not for those companies, they hope to get rich out of it, but will be for China.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting, and really just to really catch up on what everyone else has already said so far today. I think what's really also very interesting is actually China needs to really use this opportunity to have a bigger say in global governance, and that's to do with environment, whether it's to do with project financing, even in terms of geopolitics. I think China, as we've observed, has been very quiet, at least on the surface, transparent to everyone. But obviously, with increasing economic power, it's an absolute must for China to have, some
do
sort
me
of
a favour,
say.
get back to those two particular points. How do you advise companies to get involved? In what way? Because it's difficult dealing with
Absolutely.
culture you don't know. And
Exactly.
secondly, what will, in your opinion, China get out of it?
Number one, most investors who are looking at the Belt and Road Initiative don't actually understand the activities along the Belt and Road. What we try to advise through our set of indices is actually tracking trade flows, capital flow, as well as people flow. So a lot of activity on the Belt and Road are not captured by a lot of people because most people concentrate on the big, large-scale project financing and also sort of big projects that is very much in the media. So the other sort of activities along the Belt and Road, and I talked about tourism already, there's also other aspects. For example, if we look at how private investors can get involved, for example, funds are being set up right now looking at sovereign bonds, so effectively bonds that are issued out of these Belt and Road countries. That could be,
Promissories.
yeah, exactly, that could be put together into some sort of a portfolio, and we help our investors to look at which of these bonds might be, more profitable if you invest into them. And that
Jinny,
comes from
your clients have all the time in the world to listen to you, and I'm sure they're delighted to do so, but we have a time limit on the programme. So question number 2 is not going to you, it's going to go over here. You may want to respond to some of that, but we're getting short of time. What will China get out of this, do you think?
The way I see it, again, and I think the discussion is pointing towards the fact that closer economic interaction and investment does lead to geopolitical challenges and opportunities for China to be more active. I'm using active word in inverted comma because active is what I meant by empire building. Because the moment, for instance, Chinese tourists are going somewhere, China is investing heavily, and this political instability and Chinese workers get kidnapped or tourists get kidnapped, right? What would China do? Would China keep out under its official foreign policy of non-interference, or would it send its own military, in extreme case, to rescue the tourists or workers? If it is going to do the latter, which is likely to be the case, then we are reaching a situation where China will behave like an empire in making that sort of thing. What China hopes to gain out of this is two, apart from economic, mainly political and geopolitical. It's not only, let's say, increasing influence over neighborhood, so that's neo-colonialism indirectly and possible colonialism, but more crucially stabilizing its own territory, particularly the situation in Xinjiang, where Uyghur Turkic Muslims live, where their rights are suppressed, where human rights are gone, far west. And except that when we take example of Tibet and Xinjiang, right, essentially that's almost 40% of Chinese territory. So one way what China would insist is all neighboring countries will have to accept Chinese narrative around minority issue. And therefore what we'd find is the minorities in China would get suppressed more, the Democrats in China would get suppressed more.
And China's saying this is going to benefit people such as the Uyghurs in the West.
Yes, but that's
is that nonsense?
Look, I won't say it's nonsense because of course some Uyghurs would benefit, but it implies that it is development is a mechanism of control rather than empowering local people. So it would be a mechanism of control because it would lead to more migration. Right. It would lead to ensuring that countries, let's say such as Turkey or India and other countries, don't support those who are seen as separatists by China.
Charlie, final thought, if you would.
The other thing that worries me is, again, looking at the European model and even bring up climate change. Most of that was used not so much to solve the climate. I'm not necessarily saying about the Chinese, I'm just saying in general, looking at Paris. It was more or less to try and hobble the United States economically. And the Europeans have tried and not been successful. China, I think, is a lot more advanced and experienced in that sort of thing. So that's the only thing I would worry about is this ganging together to somehow have an economic advantage over the United States.
I wish I could allow you all the right of reply for here and until forever, but that's all we got time for. Thank you very much indeed. One great discussion, one belt, one road, one round table. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you to my guests, and I hope we have your company next time. Bye-bye for now.